Well, today, The Telegraph reports that Sean Corby, an employee at the government-funded arbitration service, ACAS, was investigated for racism for sharing liberal articles about equality in an organisation-wide diversity and inclusion forum. Posts included quotes and articles by black writers such as Aisha Sakambe, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and also, surprisingly, myself. The complaints alleged that Corby's views made them feel unsafe. The case has highlighted how well-meaning but often wrong-headed diversity and inclusion approaches are being exploited to shut down debate about race and gender policies. Well, in his first TV interview about the case, Sean Corby joins me now, and alongside him, Toby Young, General Secretary of the Free Speech Union, who has supported Sean through this case. Thank you for joining me, Bo. Firstly, we'll speak to Toby first. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Toby. I mean, firstly, it's been 2 years now since you created the Free Speech Union, and it's done a lot of widely known and excellent work. I mean, could you just tell me a bit more about some of the problems that are going on within our institutions in terms of ideological discrimination and often thought policing?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Inaya. We set up the Free Speech Union about 2 years ago, and about half of our work now is casework, dealing with individual cases, people who reach out to us for help. About half of them are students or academics, and about half are people like Sean, employees of either public sector or private sector companies. And quite often, what they want help with is someone having issued a formal complaint to their employer about the fact that they've challenged the prevailing ideological dogma within their company. And in Sean's case, that's what happened. Sean discovered, and many of our members have discovered this, that if you challenge the idea that all outcome discrepancies in our society when it comes to things like education, employment, income, housing, that all of those discrepancies between ethnic groups, if you challenge the idea that they're caused by systemic racism, fueled in large part by unconscious bias, requiring companies to spend vast sums of money on various diversity training programs, if you challenge any of that, you are identified effectively as a racist, and people will make serious complaints about you, which in some cases can result in your getting fired. So people who haven't said anything remotely unlawful, nothing that would meet the threshold of stirring up racial hatred under the Public Order Act, nothing like that, just people who put an alternative point of view. Maybe our society is not as riddled with racism from top to bottom as the diversitycrats in my company are claiming. Maybe there's more than one cause of ethnic outcome discrepancies across these various fields. Let's look at it from a multiple of perspectives, and let's bring in the voices of some dissenting black intellectuals on these issues, which is precisely what Sean wanted to do. And as a result, he then had to deal with a terrible, drawn-out, extended complaints procedure. And even though he was initially exonerated, one thing we've discovered over and over again at the Free Speech Union is that the process is the punishment. He shouldn't have had to go through this, justify himself, seen his employment jeopardized in this way, simply for expressing his perfectly lawful, perfectly legitimate, respectable point of view on what are, after all, politically contentious issues.
Well, we just want to emphasize that we're struggling to connect to Sean right now. He has some connectivity issues, but we will get him as soon as we can. I mean, Toby, what can be done about this? I mean, we have a Conservative government, and many people argue that part of the reason why they were elected was perhaps a kind of social conservatism, but they have seemingly so far been unable to stem some of the problems going on widespread within society.
Well, there are sort of three things you can do. The first is you can fight back robustly when you're put through one of these complaints procedures. And if you're a member of the Free Speech Union, we will help you do that. And we spend a lot of time helping people do that. We have a full-time chief legal counsel, a new legal officer who's with us for 4 days a week. And they spend most of their time helping people like Sean navigate these complaints procedures and make sure they don't lose their jobs and aren't penalised in any way. If that's unsuccessful, we can help employees who've lost their jobs take their employers to court. We recently took a train conductor called Jeremy Sleeth. We helped him take West Midlands trains to the Employment Tribunal. He had been fired for saying on Freedom Day, July 19th, thank God the pubs are reopening. I don't want to live in an alcohol-free Muslim caliphate for the rest of my days. Now, he said that on his private Facebook account, not in the workplace. But nonetheless, a colleague at West Midlands Trains complained, and he was dismissed for gross misconduct after one of these protracted investigations. We helped him take West Midlands Trains to the Employment Tribunal, and the Employment Tribunal found that he had been unfairly dismissed. So he won that. But there's only so much you can do, I think. In the courts or in these kangaroo courts within companies. Ultimately, I think there has to be a change to the law. And one of the things the Free Speech Union will be lobbying for is to try and persuade this government to make it so it becomes unlawful for employees to be investigated for anything they've said outside the workplace, outside office hours, anything they've said which is more than 12 months old. There has to be a statute of limitations on offence archaeology on Twitter and Facebook, with people trawling through everything people have said on social media, looking for reasons to complain about them and to get them into trouble for political reasons, not because they were genuinely offended by them or genuinely don't feel safe.
Yeah, but Toby, I mean, do you not worry of creating a kind of litigious culture of taking our employers to court, and there are a lot of these bad faith assumptions which could also be very draining? I mean, shouldn't we be trying to also be creating a culture of freedom within wider society, to which people would think it's completely absurd and ridiculous to complain about somebody expressing widely held and perfectly reasonable opinions?
Well, when the Free Speech Union goes to bat for someone like Sean, what we'll do in the first instance is we'll write to the head of HR or the CEO of the company and say, look, he shouldn't be investigated for what was a good faith contribution to this conversation. You've said you want an open conversation about race. You want to consider points of view that haven't been considered before on this issue, particularly points of view from people of colour. All he was doing was suggesting that these black intellectuals and their perspective on these issues, which happens not to be the same as the diversity grants within your company, they should be considered. These voices need to be heard if we're going to have the open conversation. But that's not usually enough. You would think that most employers, heads of HR, on hearing that, on thinking about it, reflecting about it, would think, well, OK, actually, it's absurd. This complaint should just be dismissed immediately. But they don't. They feel obliged to investigate them. The investigations can last from 6 months to a year. And we found, unfortunately, in Aya, that often threatening court action is the only language they'll understand.
And finally, I mean, do you think that things need to go further? I mean, do you think that as a society we should really be looking at some of these policies and practices around diversity and inclusion, as in some ways the structure of them, the incentives around them, just make it too easy for opportunistic individuals to exploit for their own political purposes?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think there are some interesting and important conversations to be had around equity, diversity and inclusion. The problem is that those conversations have been completely dominated by just one particular perspective, the woke perspective informed by critical race theory, the perspective that maintains that our society is riddled with racism and has been for decades, and it's the legacy of colonialism and the British Empire, and we're every bit as bad as America, and so on and so forth. It's effectively an American ideology that has found its way into all sorts of companies across the public and private sector, as well as universities, museums, galleries, heritage institutions, the performing arts sector. It's a particular dogmatic ideology. And if anyone dissents from it, if anyone says, actually, there are some other points of view that should be taken into account when formulating these policies, when deciding what's gone wrong and how to have a more equitable, diverse workplace, they immediately get stamped on and smeared as racist and can end up, in some cases, losing their jobs. I think what we need to do, what people like you need to do, Inaya, is to make it clear that there is a multiplicity, a diversity of viewpoints on these important issues, and many different voices from many different political perspectives need to be heard if we're going to actually make genuine improvements to the workplace, to our universities and so forth.
No, fantastic words, Toby. Thank you so much. Toby Young, General Secretary of the Free Speech Union. I'm very glad now to be joined by Sean Corby. Thank you for joining me this afternoon, Sean. I mean, Toby, outlined very briefly your case, and it has been revealed that despite the fact that you were cleared, understandably and rightfully so, of any wrongdoing, that an appeal has been lodged continuing this process. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, yeah. But I only learned that on Friday. ACAS guidance from its code of conduct that, as you'll know, employment judges respect clearly indicates that a appeal should be made ideally within 5 days. So why I'm only hearing about it now, I don't know, but that seems to be quite consistent with ACAS's handling of my case from the beginning, which I would argue has been very much in contravention of its own code of conduct on discipline and grievance.
And one of the things that Toby said was that the process is the punishment. I mean, do you agree with that? That even though you were cleared, it is this long and arduous and confusing and opaque process, which can be just as demoralising for people that are going through it.
Yeah, well, I've taught discipline and grievance process when I was working for the Good Practice Services team. And so I know what we charge employers to be trained in discipline and grievance and how to conduct grievance procedures like this. And from the absolute get-go, ACAS has failed to comply with its own guidance. And this has been dragged out. At first, they didn't even tell me that there was a grievance. They didn't tell me anything. The grievance only came after I submitted my grievance with support of Emma Stopford at Affinity. And that's after I'd reached out for support from the Free Speech Union, which without that support, I would have been isolated and destroyed.
And I mean, how do you think this has been allowed to happen? I mean, this is obviously a very big question, but ACAS, an institution that is an arbitration service, you would assume that they would have best practices for dealing with that. But do you have any sense of how this has been allowed to happen?
I have different viewpoints on this. I think we're dealing with obviously the procedural thing. At best, it's incompetent. At worst, I think that it might be that there's a case here where certain figures in senior management have been complicit in this, either because they themselves hold this ideology, or they're being bullied by cabals of people that hold this ideology that are actually extremists that use various tactics to bully senior leadership into going along with it. And also, one of the points of me posting the articles that I did was to raise awareness amongst people of different perspectives. There is not one perspective only on any of these issues, and nobody has the right to say that they are the spokesperson on this issue. And I posted, you know, if I was here in Aya and I was saying, okay, this bloke, he said something a bit borderline, but, you know, he's married to a black woman, he's got black kids, he's socialised for most of his life with black people and lived much of his life professionally around black communities. So we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. That's not what's happened here. I've not said anything that's borderline. In fact, most of what I posted was not my thoughts anyway, although obviously I'm in agreement with them. They were posted by erudite black intellectuals, thinkers, commentators, authors and artists. And 4 members of staff have attacked me in a malicious, vicious way. And I would assert that, in fact, if they're to search their hearts, it's they who are the bigots. They could not tolerate a man who they believe to be just a white man talking about such issues. And I pretty much believe that if I'd have put up an article about, for instance, Marcus Garvey, they'd have probably been upset by that as well, because they'd have thought, what temerity has this guy got to be talking on an issue that only we are allowed to issue? And of course, they're just as cruel, just as malicious about other black people who don't hold their views. And I dare say they'd have some terrible things to say about my wife and other people that share the kind of viewpoints that I do, because I've been party to that abuse in the past.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and solidarity with you, Sean, through all of this. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Well,
thank you.
After the break, I'll be asking, where is the left as the cost of living crisis is ballooning, with Ashley Frawley? And all that and much more right after the break.